So I am the chair of the next group, which is 1990 and beyond, which is actually an era of 25 years.
Lumps a lot together.
So we're a unique group because the 1990s plus, most of us weren't actually in work group with Mort, because Mort retired around that time, and so we weren't didn't have the work group experience. What we had is one-to-one private coaching with Mort Deutsch, which was a different experience, but we consider ourselves kind of the grand students of Mort Deutsch. We have a little work group envy, because it sounds like it was an extraordinary experience. And so it's a long swath of time that we're going to cover now. And there are a few of us that have prepared some stories or comments, but I think that there's a fairly sizable group of folks here. So can people from 1990 plus just stand so I can have some picture of who is here? All right, so what we've prepared to do is we'll speak in this order. Evan Weitzman will speak first, Martha Gephardt will talk, John Barquette will speak. I'll then probably open it up to some comments from others if you wish. Then I'll maybe say a few words to end, then Mort would like to, he wants a chance to retort some of the accusations. He still takes serious issues with the whole car story. He doesn't has any memory of that. So we'll conclude that, and then at that point we can move downstairs and have a little bit of a celebration downstairs. Sound good? Good. Good? Everybody sufficiently awake? Evan, you're up.
Good afternoon, everybody. I feel like this whole day is a tough act to follow at this point. It's been an extraordinary day, and I feel really filled up with everything that I've been hearing. And I actually, before starting to talk directly about Mort, one of the things that's overwhelming to me today is that I'm in a room with like all of the important mentors in my life. So not only Mort, but Harvey, and Kenneth Soul was here before. We're all tremendously important to me in learning how to do what I do. And then I met Barbara Bunker when Harvey had me staffing the ODHRM program and learned so much from you. And then Madeline hired me into my first academic job and mentored me in my first experiences as a professor. So it's, you know, this is like big stuff. And then like, so I'm a professor at UMass Boston, and like half of my syllabi are represented in this room. So I'm not going to start naming you all because I'll leave somebody out, but there are so many people here who either you're on my syllabi or I send my students to your work when their interests line up. It's an amazing thing, Mort, that you built. It's extraordinary. So anyway, so a few thoughts, and I've got these on my phone because I'm traveling and I couldn't get to a printer. Anyway, I wanted to mention mentors and all the mentors here because I think mentoring is an incredibly generous thing to do. And Mort taught us all that through his example, right? And so and so many of you, as I just mentioned, have stepped up in my own experience, and I'm sure with other people. So I want to just briefly say how I got to study with Mort at TC was after college, I'd done a variety of different kinds of social change stuff or politically oriented stuff. My first job was working for the Mondale Ferraro campaign. That was quite an experience, as you can imagine. Did some work for a labor law firm, was thinking about law and stuff like that. Anyway, when I wanted to go to grad school, I thought I was going to do political psychology. And so I started networking and talking to people about where I should go. And first it was Ken Gergen, who had been my undergrad social psych professor, told me I should go up to Columbia and talk to Morton Deutsch. And I kept talking to people, and then Serge Moscovici, who I'd taken a graduate course with down at the New School, said, you got to go up to Columbia and talk to Morton Deutsch. And a third person said, all right. So I went and I read some of Morton's stuff in the library down at the New School, and it hit. it hit so close to home. And then I went and met with Mort, and it hit even closer to home. And then somehow I got into the program. So it took several messages, and then the same thing repeated itself when I was then, I had been at NYU as a visiting professor for a couple of years, and I was looking for a tenure track job. And Mort sent me a notice in the mail. We used snail mail in those days, you may remember, and sent me a notice about this job at UMass Boston, which was launching a new master's program in conflict resolution. And I never heard of UMass Boston, so I threw it in the trash. And I went back to work. And I had a couple of other job offers at that point. I wasn't too interested. And then Mort called me about 2 weeks later, and he said, "Did you apply for that job?" And I said, "What job?" He said, "The job at UMass Boston." So anyway, so I applied for the job, and Mort was right, and that was the place for me to be. I'm talking fast, I'm nervous. I want to touch on something that came up as we were speaking earlier out in the hall, which was, by the way, there were still work groups when I got here. That was, the late 80s, early 90s, we still had some. But I had come in 1988, and then in 1990, Mort was made to retire because of age. And it was a bizarre thing because the state of New York was phasing out mandatory retirement and had given institutions a choice about whether or not to keep the rule or just end it then. And Columbia, in its wisdom, decided to keep the rule. And so Mort and Maxine Green, as I understand, became the first emeritus professors here. And then there was this wonderful rule that said, but you couldn't teach required courses, like the theory of conflict resolution, of course. And you couldn't supervise doctoral dissertations. And so there was a whole bunch of us who had come here to study with Mort who how shall I put it, freaked out. But then Sang was the first person, as I recall, who was coming up to defend at that point, and went and challenged it, and Sang got to defend, to continue to work with Mort, and so did the rest of us. And so that was wonderful. And you can all see how, how retired Mort is, right? Anyway, there's something that Mort often said, and I bet you've all heard it, and Susan touched on it in her remarks earlier, and it's something that's been deeply meaningful for me throughout my career, which is, he said, I'm sure you heard it, he always said that he was looking for people with soft hearts and hard heads. Right? Soft hearts and hard heads. And that was so important to me. It was always essential to him that we care deeply about the world and be passionately committed to making it better. But at the same time, we had to be clear-headed and disciplined thinkers if we were going to do anything about it. That's a message that struck, as I said, struck deeply. He didn't only look for people who had that orientation, but he also inculcated it in us, right? He developed that in us. He developed the ability to hang on to the passion and to hang on to the caring and get tougher and tougher about our thinking and how we went at it. And that's a deep gift. So I talk about this with students all the time. I talk about it with my grad students in the conflict resolution program at UMass. We have every other year we have an international graduate student conference in conflict resolution. We get students from all over the world, so I always talk about this. And so, why soft hearts and hard heads? Soft hearts. If you work with conflict, chances are you do it because you care about something enough to do challenging, sometimes painful work. That's good. The world needs more people like you. Hard heads, but this is the tricky part. It's good to be a softie. It's good to let your caring and your compassion drive your work, but once you settle on a problem, now you have to think carefully, clearly, deeply, and systematically about the problem you're trying to solve. You have to hold yourself to high standards. You have to subject your work to rigorous tests, whether it's empirical research or practice in the field. You have to be willing to accept answers you don't like. Because as much as the world needs more people who care, what the world needs even more is people who care and who also have what it takes to do something about the things they care about. Right? So we've been hearing all day from people who got that message loud and clear. And that's as important a part of the legacy, I think, as anything. I want to say that personally I benefited enormously from Mort's mentoring in that respect. He helped me learn what it meant to apply careful analytical thinking in even the most challenging conflict situations, whether in the role of researcher or conflict intervener. I also learned, under your guidance, Mort, the essential truth that in order to be able to help others in conflict to see one another's perspectives and reach agreements in the midst of horribly painful conflict, I had to be able to do the same in the most difficult conflicts in my own life. And I hope I've risen to the challenge. Finally, I want to say a word about Mort's impact on me professionally, and I'm doing this in part because I recognize the way in which this has been echoed by everybody else here, I think. As a practitioner, I work with people in conflict in many contexts and in many places. Right now I'm working with the Interfaith Mediation Center, which is a major interfaith peace effort in northern Nigeria, with a group called Ultimate Peace that uses ultimate frisbee to bring together Arab Israeli, Jewish Israeli, and Palestinian kids. With the Bridges Project, which brings together the most senior federal law enforcement officials in Massachusetts, leaders of the local Muslim and Sikh communities. And with the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, and this harkens back to what we were hearing from the 60s group at the beginning, SEIU has now dedicated its significant resources, and if you don't know, this is a union of 2 million people that is probably the largest and most powerful progressive organization that we've got in the country. They have now decided that they are dedicating themselves to ending racial inequality. Right? So, about grandiose ambitions, but these guys have got some stuff to put behind that. And so I'm working with them, part of a group there that uses OD and conflict resolution, and what I learned about equity and inclusion from Mort and other colleagues here to help them with that. As an academic, I went in 1995, as I said, I went to help build what's now the graduate programs in conflict resolution, which we've now built into the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance at UMass Boston. Since '95, we've awarded 259 graduate certificates, 150 Masters of Arts degrees in conflict resolution, and I want to tell you what some of our former students have done, because this is the direct lineage, and I know you guys are all part of it too, in terms of what you've trained, what the students you've trained have done. They've been ombudsmen at major institutions. Our alumni lead the mediation programs at the World Bank and under John Barkat's direction at the United Nations. They develop and lead online dispute resolution programs for eBay and PayPal, a system that handles 60 million conflicts a year. They work in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the U.S. Department of State, serve on the Peace and Reconciliation Committee for the Nigerian state of Kaduna, and one served as the peace advisor to President Arroyo of the Philippines. So Mort's teaching and leadership has been in the heart of all of this. And I think to truly appreciate the scale of what Mort's contributed to the cause of peace in the world, you have to appreciate the enormous collective impact of his students and their students and theirs, and it goes on and it goes on, and it's amazing. Thank you.
So my name is Martha Gephardt, and this has been an extraordinary day. And I was saying to someone before today's event that apart from my father, the most important person influencing my life was Morton Deutsch. And I actually started in this program studying with Mort in the 80s, but I'm listed in 90s and beyond because it took me quite a while to finish my doctoral dissertation. It was called Pulling It Out at the Last Minute, before it was too late. And there was what people refer to as the deadline after which Mort might not be able to be a sponsor, and that got changed, but that was the moment at which I actually finished it. I'd like to say a few things about how I came to be in this program, because at the time I was directing the Africa program at the Social Science Research Council and doing a lot of international travel and work. And I was a Ph.D. candidate in the political science department here on the main campus. And my dissertation was well underway, and it was on the role of internal conflict affecting external conflict in African countries. And it was an interesting project, but I was becoming concerned about what the discipline of political science was becoming. People were doing all these mindless quantitative studies that didn't meet the basic assumptions, and I was thinking, I don't want to be a professor of political science anywhere. What am I going to do? Well, I went to Vermont and ski bummed for a season, and then I thought, now I have to deal with it. And because I had a full-time job in New York City, I needed, if I was going to change into a different field, and I was thinking of psychology, I would need to do it someplace in New York. And I knew people at NYU and at CUNY, and I went to NYU first and CUNY second, and I got these really rigid responses about how difficult or almost impossible it would be for me to move from the work I'd done in political science into getting a doctorate in psychology. And I knew of Mort Deutsch's work, but I didn't know him. But I worked on conflict, and I had clinical and organizational interests, and I also was interdisciplinary in my orientation. And a couple of people had said, you know, you should go talk to Morton Deutsch because he's interested in all this stuff. So I came to Teachers College, and Morton Deutsch met with me, and I explained the dilemma that I was in and what I was trying to explore. And Mort said, well, Martha, you're almost finished with your doctorate. What you need to do is transfer all the credits you can, take the required courses, and do your dissertation. And here are the names of 4 students in the program, and why don't you get in touch with them and talk to them about the program? And I thought, oh my gosh, this is it. So that was the beginning of my work with Mort Deutsch. And I did transfer many, many credits, and Mort helped with all of that, and I did take the required courses, and I was in Mort's work group, and it was an amazing experience, and I did my dissertation on the escalation of marital conflict. And I wanted to study escalating conflict, and Mort and I talked about what contexts would be good ones for really understanding the dynamics of the processes of escalation and de-escalation. And I did an interview study with 30 couples, 60 spouses, and there was a critical hypothesis I had about escalation being a response to a perceived threat to self-esteem, but I wasn't sure how I was going to surface that in my interviews, and Mort very quietly told me the question to ask. And I tried it out in my pilot studies, and it worked. And so I studied escalating conflicts that ended badly, ones that ended well, and what predicted that, and ones that didn't escalate at all. And it was a long dissertation, and it took me a while to do it. And periodically, Mort and I live in the same neighborhood. He lives on 86th Street, I live on 85th Street. And periodically at the bus stop, he would say to me, you know, it's not too late to publish that work you did, or to analyze the qualitative data from my interviews. And let me back up and say kind of what's happened to me since then. But going back in time, next week my colleague Victoria Marsick and I here at Teachers College are about to submit the final chapter for a book we've been working on for almost 10 years called Strategic Organizational Learning. And I thought, once this is out the door, I'm going to take those interviews from my escalating conflict study. And my dissertation was primarily quantitative, but now I'm going to go back and really analyze the qualitative data from those interviews. But so it took me a while to finish my dissertation, and I continued to work at the Social Science Research Council until I did get my degree in 1993. And then I was convinced to take a job as a senior vice president at the American Society for Training and Development. And for 2 years I ran their research and development program. And it was an organization with a lot of systems problems, which is actually true of Teachers College as well. But I hadn't encountered a really dysfunctional organization until this moment in my life. And the president had a heart attack and had hired 3 senior vice presidents, thinking that that was somehow going to get the work of the organization better done, but he didn't really give up any power. So I did that for 2 years, and then I thought, this is hopeless. But I had a friend who knew somebody in the Department of Labor, an attorney in the Department of Labor. So I met with this guy, and he helped me figure out how to negotiate a collaborative way out of this organization with a big consulting contract. And I came back to New York. And in 1996, I started doing some teaching here at Teachers College. And in 1999, with my colleague Victoria Marsick, I set up a new institute and became a research professor. And so for the past 15 years, I've actually been a research professor here at Teachers College. And much of what we have done through the institute is do consulting and research-driven consulting and change work in all kinds of organizational settings. But in the year 2000, I thought, I have a chance to design a new course. And Mort's work with students and Mort's work with me was the inspiration behind my new course. It was called Research and Organizational Learning, and it was a research course that required students to do a major project about something they were really interested in and committed to. And one of my goals was to get students to have a chance to take on something in which they would change the world and learn to use rigorous research to drive that work. And so I taught that course for 15 years. And students would say it was the most difficult course in the college, but I didn't give any grades until they passed the A threshold. And at the end, they all produced these amazing products. And I became an important person in the lives of many of these students who have done incredible things since then. One of my students did a study of whistleblowing in the financial services industry, which was a scary project, and she's now defended her dissertation, and she's German, and she spoke in the House of Lords. And at night, sometimes I think about the wonderful things that my students have done and how fortunate I was to learn how to inspire students and be a mentor, from being inspired by Mort and having him be my mentor. And so I'm really thankful to be here today, and I think that the work that you've done, and now that I've seen all these other students who've had the same experience that I've had, it's amazing. And I feel proud to be part of the family. And then there's a small thing that I wanted to mention, which is that because Mort and I live in the same neighborhood, we used to be sometimes waiting for the bus together at the bus stop. And we had small conversations that often were about things that turned out to be important to me. And I'm just going to share one of them with you. I was at the bus stop one day with Mort, and I said, you know, I'm always pulling irons out of the fire at the last minute. I'm always doing stuff at the last minute. And I absolutely have to change this. And Mort said, Martha, if we didn't have deadlines, we wouldn't get anything done. And if we were getting things done long before the deadline, we wouldn't be making the best use of our time. And I stopped and I thought, aha, instead of worrying about pulling irons out of the fire at the last minute, what I need to do is acquire and polish the skill of getting things done and out the door at the last minute before it's too late. And now when I have students who talk to me about how they're behind and it's frantic and what are they going to do, I explain that the time to get it done is right before the deadline and out the door. And although that's in some ways a small thing, it changed my life. And it has been an incredible pleasure to work with Mort, and also today to be here with all the rest of you. Thank you, Mort.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to add my voice. Let me say a few words about Mort. He's great. Enough about Mort, let's talk about me. somebody asked me before I came up, they said, how come you haven't spoken yet? I said, this is by year you finished, not by age. What are you trying to say? But I had the great privilege in the more recent period to finish my program with Morton, and he was my dissertation advisor, and very inspirational for me. And I'm going to begin by recounting a period when I worked for the United Nations where I was in Afghanistan and I was thinking about all the times I traveled internationally and come back and people say, what did you see and what did you do? And I say, nothing. I saw, the inside of a room, or I saw, whatever the work-related thing was. And so I was determined to bring something back. And so I wanted to go buy a carpet. And when you're buying a carpet, you have to negotiate. This is a big thing. So you're actually applying everything you've learned. So I thought this was my chance to apply all the things that Mort had taught me about. But I flashed back because he also asked me to help buy the car. I did, but he hasn't paid me back yet. So I thought, maybe I need to try a different tack. So I was going all around trying to think about what I would find and what would be unique. And I'll loop back to that in just a little bit. But my career before I came here, I was a community mediator. I had worked at another university. I had been teaching MBA courses and worked in the corporate sector a bit. And I was looking for a place to do my program and found Mort because mediation was what I was doing in the community, and his work was deeply resonating with my own. I had had a few experiences where I had approached at other universities and this university, people who had been advisors of departments or heads of areas who I had sat with, and they effectively said, only 6 people make it into this program, and let me tell you about how qualified they are. Why do you think there is room for you? Nobody knows this person, right? Or people like this. So the difference was when I sat with Mort, he had immediately genuine curiosity at what I could bring to the work and about the questions that I had and the relevance and experience of what I had, as he has had with everyone here in this room. And that deeply characterized, I think, Mort and his approach, and was very influential in my decision to continue my work here. So I did, and I ended up doing research on different types of identity and other types of conflicts and how to turn those around. I remember sitting and finishing my dissertation finally, and if I recall well in the acknowledgement of my dissertation, it said, I'm writing this as warplanes are flying overhead, shaking the windows of my house, because it was just the days after 9/11 when I was finishing. And I have never felt the reality and the importance of what I have been studying more than that moment in my time, as many of you have had at different of those quintessential moments in your lives as well. But all of that to say that what drew me and what kept me and what encouraged me and gave my work focus was what I saw in Mort. Mort has a sense of humility. It's never about looking at me, him, but always about the research, the idea, and the application. He always stresses the rigor, the academic rigor, and I remember distinctly sitting in a classroom, and there was a couple of students who were doing presentations on some work and research question they had done. And Mort is such a wonderfully kind and empowering and generous person that I had never seen the dark side of Mort. And so let me tell you about the time Mort threw a tantrum. So these students got up and did this presentation off the cuff, and they thought they were hot stuff, I think, maybe. And Mort said, there's no excuse for bad psychology. And that was it. And that was his tantrum. He's accepting and empowering and always quick to see the importance of ideas and the importance of us as people. Maybe the one thing I'd just like to think about is we are representing, in this group, the 90s and beyond, and just a challenge to all of us to think about the beyond a little bit. Because as I think about everything that I've received from those of you in this room, directly and indirectly through Mort and his work, the three things that I've thought that are challenges to me that perhaps I am going to try to do better at, that maybe we all could do, is I still see too many papers coming out that sounds like Ken's blueprint kind of document, right? And I still look at them and say, I have a Ph.D. and I don't understand this and I don't see the applicability of this in my work. And so the three things I thought is that the practitioners are not sometimes seeing the relevance of the work of the research group, and we're not making it easy for them. And thirdly, there's a thirst for it if we can learn how to speak that language. And I've been trying to find ways to do that in my organization to see how we can bridge that and speak the language of this. One example was there was a very well-regarded mediation group who I connected with the climate change folks in the UN, who I've been working with for years to encourage them to try a different approach to their negotiations. And they were very ripe and open to it, and the group finally met with them, and I saw the head of the climate area maybe 6 months later, and I said, so what'd you think? And they said, they completely don't understand our work and our business and our approach, we're trying something else. And I thought it's a shame, because I see the value in both, but somehow we're not making it. But what I've seen in Mort is that he does find ways to look at that. He finds ways to ask the big questions, but finds ways to find the entry points to make them practical for people and groups. So he asks the relevant question and finds the right entry point. Even with building a global community, he's looking for ways that individuals can apply this in their lives and action it. So Mort has also, not only in this emphasis on work, but personally, Mort, you have always evidenced and manifested and exemplified genuine curiosity, rigorous intellectual pursuit, the practical application and relevance of what we do, humility in how we approach our work in each other, empowerment of people around us, and a dogged belief in the value of each one of our ideas that we bring to the table. I remember trying to, in different situations, I often try to think about how different heroes of mine would handle situations, including Mort. And it can get challenging. I was mediating a case in Afghanistan, and then we were in the southern part, in the Pashtun region, and I was trying to think about, integrative solutions to this problem and how to, wedge the Mort's crude law into the agreement and everything I could think of that would be like a rabbit out of the hat that would mend this thing. And finally we did it, and I won't give you the details of it, but we finally got a resolution after days and days and days, and it was a very, very heightened negotiation. And in the end of the resolution, I said, we had a mediation agreement, I said, so what would make this agreement work for you, for the parties? And I said, this is the chance to get them to be empowered and to bring to the table what will work for them. And they said, well, one is we would do a typical religious prayer. And I said, great, okay, what else? They said, oh, and then we will sacrifice a big animal. And I said, okay. And so sometimes the theory, I don't know, we'll have to talk about that. I ended up buying on that trip, not a typical carpet, but I found one made by a local artist who takes scraps of tapestry from abused, tattered, old carpets and takes those pieces and sews them together into an artistic quilt. And I thought, that is so much about what Mort does and has done with all of us. Mort, you take this unique vision along with artistry and creativity and an attention to detail, and you see the value in otherwise easily discarded plain pieces of fabric, and you see the importance, usefulness, and beauty in each one of them. And so you thread them together with curiosity, with rigorous intellectual pursuit, practical application, humility, empowerment, and the dogged belief that each one of our ideas is useful. And I thank you for that.
Well, Professor Deutsch, I hope that you feel the love and the admiration and the impact. The impact is huge. It's been a long day. There are a few other folks that I think want to say some things. When we go downstairs, I'll do a more formal celebration of you, but I have to tell a couple of stories, right? There are a couple of small stories that I need to tell about my engagement with Mort. So I did come to Columbia to meet Mort and work with him, even though he was sort of retiring. So I came here as a master's student initially, and I went to an orientation and met somebody in the social work psych program here named Margaret Krakow, who was at the time an instructor here. And she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'd like to work in the field of conflict and peace, and I understand that Morton Deutsch is here. And she said, yeah, he's retired now. And so I said, well, does he do anything? Does he teach? Is he around? And she said, well, he does have a work group. And I said, really? And I said, well, can you find out if I could possibly? And she just like paused for a long time, and she said, well, let me see what I could do. So she's starting to sweat and shake, and so she picks up the phone and she dials Mort. And then she turns white because he answers. And her voice is cracking, and she says, Dr. Deutsch, would you mind? I have a student, they wondered, okay, I'm sorry, absolutely, I should have known, okay. And she hangs up and she said, he's retired, he's not taking any more students. And she said, oh my God, you pick up the phone and you call God, but you never expect God to answer. So that was my first introduction to Mort. So I found out he was teaching still the conflict resolution course, and I enrolled and started to take it. And about a week or two into the course, I too was living on the Upper West Side, and I got onto a bus, the 104, to come uptown, and on 86th Street probably, Mort Deutsch gets on the bus. And so I'm sitting in the back, and I see him come, and I think, oh, maybe I should talk to him, although he's God, but maybe it's worth it. And he comes and he walks in the back and he sits down and he crosses his legs. And as he crosses his legs, I see that he has these big, bright green socks on that have these huge white peace signs on them. And I thought, there's a guy who walks his talk literally, and I got to meet this guy. So I met Mort, and it was his transition time. He was teaching now, but he was not sort of taking students anymore. But he was willing to kind of throw me some work and throw me some time, and we did start to work together. And then at some point, Harvey, and I joined Harvey's work group and worked with him for a couple of years, and then I started to work on my dissertation. And I was fortunate enough to have both Mort and Harvey on my committee. And I became interested in trying to understand power dynamics. So in the end of Mort's 1973 book, at the kind of culmination of the book, he really talks about how cooperation is important and it's great and it's good for conflict resolution, but one of the biggest challenges that there are these elite that you can't get access to or not interested, and we really have to understand how to engage and work with the elite. How do we do that constructively? What does that look like? And that's sort of a big question he leaves at the end of that book. So I had lunch with Mort and said, I'd like to do this, and Mort said to me, great. So now what you need to do is you need to think big. You need to go get out of psychology, you need to read widely and really think, what does it mean? What does power mean? How are you going to take this on? So I did. I kind of went off and I read Gandhi and King, and I was reading I was trying to Mary Parker Follett, and I was trying to explore this concept of power which is everywhere and nowhere, and I was really excited and in the middle of all this. And so I started to kind of put these things together, and I had a few conversations with Mort. Mort said, great, keep going, that sounds great, shape it, keep going. So I did, and at some point I put my thoughts together on a proposal-ish thing, and I put it in Harvey's mailbox, and within about an hour, Harvey calls and says, it's ready for you. And so I go in and I see this piece of paper and it has red marks on it, question marks, and it says, what are your moderators, where are your mediators, what is your IVDV? Harvey was saying, bring it down to earth, fellow. And that was my committee. It was this tremendous...
It would have been worse if I read it.
No doubt. But it was this tremendous energy between, so how do you get your head around something so critical, but also do research, right? And it was a great dance, and it was a little painful out of the gates, but ultimately it was a fabulous experience. And so I want to thank you for that. So just one other thing I want to say. So in '97, I joined faculty here and then started to co-direct the center, and then in '98 became the director of the center. And at that time, I kind of sat down with Mort and said, you know, he had hired me to take this job, and so I said, so, you know, what is your vision for how the center will move forward? And he said, well, that's not the question. The question is, what is your vision? He said, I've done what I've done, and you have what you have here, and now it's yours. And now what I want you to do is take this and make it work for you. Do it the way you would do it. And it really was inspiring for two reasons. One, because it was really empowering for me to get that message, but also because I knew the foundation of what Mort had set up, the intellectual infrastructure that was present at the center, how he shaped how I think and how a lot of the people around the center thought and did their work, was really the basis that we've grown the center. So if you haven't been to the new center, the Morton Deutsch Center, please come. It's a couple doors down from where the event will be in a half hour. But it's now really a thriving international center. We have projects all over the world. We're doing peace building in Myanmar, we're doing work in Colombia, we've worked in Israel-Palestine. We have field projects in many conflict zones around the world. There's a thriving group of students, decently funded students, not perfectly funded students, but decently funded students, and we're working on areas of the dynamics of justice, sustainable peace, mediation. A lot of the basics that you had talked about today continue to thrive here. And it really is from the infrastructure of Mort, and from what I often say is stealing his best ideas. What I find myself doing is going back frequently, reading Lewin and reading Deutsch, and then realizing, you know, there's this great set of ideas here that he put out in 1976 with Wish, Deutsch, and Kaplan, which are the fundamental dimensions of interpersonal relationships, and no one's ever taken that and really developed that further. And so I steal these great nuggets that are hidden sometimes in these places and take them forward and build on them. And there's such a great foundation. It is such a treasure trove of ideas and insights that are now really having a different level of impact. So thank you, Mort. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be with you for all these years. It really has been determining of my life. Okay. So, anybody else want to share? Yes, Ken.
Thank you. I'm kind of an outlier in this group because I was a late arriver, and I had a distinction, which I think is still true, that I had the privilege of being in the last class that Mort was to teach. Peter did much of it, but Mort did the other part. I don't know if you broke that rule and went beyond that or not, but it got me a taste of Mort, but almost more dramatic, came from the ripple effect that we're all familiar with. We know that the things we do, things that you do today, all have a ripple effect to places we sometimes don't even know where. But I'm sure you've had occasional interruptions. Oh, I didn't know you noticed. Oh, I didn't know that stuck with you. And the most direct effect was if Harvey is the son of Mort, I can be a sort of grandson, having been through his work group, distinguished member of which way ahead of me was Peter Pullman. learning about social identity theory, spending some time on the streets of New York, quietly planting dollar bills to see who picked them up. Somewhere, counting what returned and so on. And so that was, as I wrote my dissertation dedication page, which I looked at the other day, Harvey helped make me the scholar that I am, to the extent I am. But it didn't end there. One of the things that happened when I was doing my qualifying paper under a faculty member named Keith Allred was around conflict resolution, negotiation in fact. And Keith said, you know, you could present this. Why don't you go to the International Association for Conflict Management? I said, wow. And so I went to their meeting months later, which turned out to be in Bonn, Germany. And even though I was older than the average doctoral student, my goal was to finish by age 55, which I succeeded at, I was still a rookie there. And I knew that attending was one of the real masters of conflict resolution and management, but I'd never met him. But I had the nerve to go up to Roy Lewicki. And he said, oh, Teachers College, we have to talk. He insisted we sit down and talked at length. And here is, like I say, a real newbie. It was such a privilege and such warmth and support, which went on after that through my dissertation with occasional good advice. More ripple effect of Morton Deutsch effect. Later on, I bump into Dean Hodgfold at different conferences, and he's, oh, Teachers College, how is Mort? How is Harvey? And he too has had all kinds of tidbits of helpful advice along the way. So it so pleases me that I can feel part of this tradition. And I guess I like to feel that some of my own ripple effect is out there in different ways, and without being grandiose, occasionally hear about it, as I bet you do too. But that is something I so owe to those of you, many of you in this room, and to Teachers College, what you have brought about. So thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Lela Pepovac. I graduated in 1991. Just want to share a very short anecdote that actually speaks more about Mort's human side than about his work and theory. Like in 1991, there were several of us who were about to defend our dissertations. And you know, after all this work, that's something that, as you all know, you want to do only once in life. So we're kind of at the end of that road, and now there's this big event coming up. And we were sitting in the work group and discussing something. So Mort, being sensitive, sensed this tension that we were all feeling, and so he actually invited himself to ask a question. Are you all kind of like nervous about your defense, possibly? So silence, I said, yeah. And then he said something that actually stayed with me for the rest of my life. He said, well, what I'd like to tell you, think of it as an opportunity rather than this big event and big thing that you have to master. He said, how many times in your life you'll have 5 reasonably intelligent people listen to you for 1 hour? He said, this may be your first and last chance. So he said, just enjoy it and remember 2 things. One is, you know way more than they do about what you're talking about. Just keep that in mind. And secondly, there is an ocean of questions they can ask you. They can really surprise you. So if that happens and you have no idea what you say, toss it back to the group. They'll compete to provide the best answer.
Others? Go ahead.
afternoon. I'm Cliff Schultz, professor and Charles H. Kelstadt Chair of Marketing at Loyola University, Chicago. And I'm actually supposed to be in Quang Binh province in Vietnam right now. But a few weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, I received this email from none other than Layla. She said, you know, it's Mort's 95th birthday. It'd be great if you'd come. And I thought, well, this is a really important project. And I pondered this a little bit further, and I thought, you know, Cliff, there would be no project like this for you for the last 25 years or so, and similar ones like that, were it not for the single course that you had from Morton Deutsch so long ago, and that was the Conflict Resolution Seminar. And so, and it really was my only course. I was a protege of Gary Bridge and Dick Christie across the street, Morris Holbrook and John O'Shaughnessy in the business school. And for the record, sort of curious, my dissertation was something like Machiavellianism, organizational structure, and performance among sales-related boundary. And almost the minute after I finished that, I thought I could make a lot of money, which was my original plan, being in this program. But also I'll have to pay for eternity in hell if I continue to pursue that, selling Wall Street, selling financial services on Wall Street using Machiavellian tactics. So the Berlin Wall had just come down, and I thought, this is a seminal moment, but let's use your business craft to try to make sense in some interesting parts of the world that are transitioning. And I thought, well, we'll work on foreign direct investment, we'll have companies go in there, and we'll try to make money. And as I started this in 1991, it became very obvious early on that the answer was not in this traditional neoliberal model, but in all those great ideas that we had in the Conflict Resolution Seminar. So, Acme Bold Game, Deutsch's Crude Law. You know, to hear Hun Sen praise Deutsch's crude law, the prime minister in Cambodia, is something rather remarkable. To use that, to use your aphorism that I come back to time and time again from Lebanon to Libya, to Vietnam, to Cambodia, the list goes on and on. Our similarities far outweigh our differences. So whatever successes that I've had and some teams that we've been able to build in the World Bank and the UN, in the Cambodian government, in the Vietnamese government, in corporations vis-a-vis corporate responsibility, making sure that when you invest in a place like Quang Binh province, that there are win-win outcomes, that people are better served, that it's not exploitive, that distributive justice is served. And I've actually self-selected into a university, if I may say so, Loyola, where the mission is distributive justice. And we find ways to have business to affect those outcomes. So were it not for you, sir, taking me and a lot of us under your wing so long ago, and on and on and on, I would not have had those modest successes. We would not have affected those policies. We would not have brought truth, justice, and better prosperity and hopes for sustainable peace in a lot of parts around the world. So I and a lot of others thank you for that.
Any other shy 1990s and beyond that'd like to have a final comment? Please.
So encouraged that just say a few words that probably to share the experience that Mort's students have scattered in different fields and different areas. I myself, as one of the deviates, went to pharmaceutical industry for the past 20 years or so. So in a way that I just to share the experience that I just retired from Sanofi as global head of comparative effectiveness and health economics. So partly that I'm also a deviate in that sense that because I spent 10 years in the Cultural Revolution, and by the time I went to college, it was 10 years behind my fellow classmates. But in any event, after all this, people say you were graduated from social psychology. How did you manage the health science in the pharmaceutical industry? Yes, I guess I actually enjoyed the work tremendously and become quite have to boast that quite an expert in the area in the pharmaceutical industry. So in a way, that just want to say thank Mort again for this opportunity, this tremendous opportunity, and also thank all the organizers and Harvey and Peter. First time I met Peter, heard you many times, but for this opportunity for us to gather here. Thank you, thank you.
Any other latecomers? Anybody? Mort, this is just a brief note from Jen Goldman, who was a student of Mort's, and she just came last night but couldn't come today, and said it's difficult to put into words the impact that you have had on my life and my career. The essence of what I have learned from you has to do with generosity, kindness, thoughtfulness. I always have felt unwavering support from you. I'm proud to consider myself one of your last dissertations. While you had so many more students before me, I always felt special and that you were giving me your undivided attention, pushing me to create quality work, always in such a supportive and thoughtful way. You always offered a different, smart way of thinking about problems, and most of all, you understand that at the end of the day, it's not only about the intellectual problems, but about the pursuit of friendship and relationship along the way. I'm always amazed by your positive outlook, the way you continue to contribute to the field and the world, one person at a time, one project at a time, one book, one chapter, an article at a time, always on the cutting edge, always thinking ahead about what the world needs and how you can make a difference in it. I'm wishing you the happiest of birthdays as you celebrate this 95th, and wish you and Lydia many, many, many more occasions. I look so forward to celebrating with you in the future. Happy birthday, Mort. So if there are no other final comments, I think, Mort, you're going to make some final comments, yes? Do you want to come up here, or do you want me to bring it to you?
There's a mic there.
I think they'll see me better.
Yeah, okay.
Let me say this has been both a heart-warming and head-enlarging event. Fortunately, Lydia will swing the head back to its I want to thank you all. I want to thank you not only for your warm and gracious comments, but I want to thank you for your great work. You have gone on and have done original, important work. I may have been a little influence on that, and I'm grateful for your comments to that effect. But I want to also say that when you were graduate students, you were an influence on me. It's not only that I influenced you, but the work groups were very stimulating. They were often led to new thoughts, new experiments that came out of our very zesty discussions. So I'm grateful to you for my work, just as you are grateful to me for your work. Whatever. I've been asked what I've been doing lately, so I'll just give you a very brief comment. I don't know if Eric is still here. Hi, Eric. Eric, I, and Sarah, however you pronounce her name, wrote an interesting paper developing a global community from a social psychological perspective. I think it's an important paper. It sketches out what needs to be done and what are some of the psychological problems that really have to be faced and confronted. Like we mentioned, for example, that in order to avoid the dilemma of the commons, where our biophysical, social, ecological environment gets destroyed because we all pursue our narrow self-interest, you have to develop a very strong sense of positive interdependence among all the people who form this global planet. That's one important thing. The second thing is you have to start thinking not only in terms of like the next 3 months in terms of the stock market. You have to think of the next 3 generations. You have to develop a perspective that is extended over time, not a short-term perspective. You have to also develop what a number of people, including Ph.D. is still here, open-mindedness, where people who have vastly different ideologies or religions are able to have constructive dialogue which help them to understand their common interests as well as their differences. And of course you have to have constructive resolution of the inevitable conflicts that occur, rather than the win-lose orientation that is so common. So that was a paper that we wrote, and in it we outlined a communication that could be given to people of the earth. We called that Imagine a Global Human Community. And we did research where we presented people with that statement, Imagine a Global Human Community, which basically is a statement that incorporates the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN and FDR's 4 freedoms. And we asked people, are you willing to join such a community? And if so, are you willing to commit yourself to take positive, constructive actions to further the development of such a community? Our results were very interesting. 70% of people were willing to join and say they were willing to commit themselves to take positive, constructive actions. And while it was true that Democrats were more willing than Republicans, liberals more willing than conservatives, the educated more willing than the uneducated, the young more willing than the old, the people who were better off more willing than the poor. In every demographic group, more than 50% of the Democrats, of the Republicans, were willing to make that commitment. More than 50% of those in the older groups were willing to make that commitment. More than 50% of those who said they were very conservative were willing to make that commitment, and so on. But we asked other questions, and one of the other questions had to do with what kind of action they would take. And that was a very interesting answer that has led to the research that we're now planning. The question got such answers as, well, I'll be a good neighbor. I'll give more money to the church. They were very specific, narrow, not politically action-oriented responses that could lead to development of the global community. So we concluded, and this is, I think, a very important conclusion that I would like to stress, like all of us, and whether we're researchers, practitioners, or just plain citizens, people often don't know how to act to achieve their objectives, particularly in the social political arena. And given the nature of the media, given the nature of the 1% and so on, they get confused and distorted information about possibilities. But it's important for us to learn how to communicate with ordinary citizens in a way which provide them with information on how to act to achieve their objectives, whether it's at this level of schools or community organizations or state government or whatever. And the study that we're planning on doing is with Lucia Chapman, in addition to our center, who is a recent graduate of the psychology department at Columbia. And we're planning a study in which we provide action things like what you could do if you want to work in the area of climate change, what you can do if you want to make women's equality your objective, what you can do in peace education. And by the way, David and Roger Johnson have written a full piece of that. So that's what I'm currently involved in. I got involved in this because I think we're at a very dangerous tipping point. I don't think we have a long time before we have to act very strongly with regard to such issues as climate change, water resources, and others. Well, that's what I'm currently involved in. I hope some of this involvement will interest you and get you to do it in this area too. But let me again thank you for your wonderful contributions here, but also in your careers. Thank you for this.